Hi guys, this is Mr. Tan, and today we're going to be looking at business strategy, and we're going to be reviewing some models in terms of strategy, in terms of moving forward, looking at Porter's generic strategies. We're also going to be looking at other models, including Porter's Five Force model and Porter's Diamond model, in terms of assessing competition in your domestic market or competition in an international market. So let's look at a definition for strategy. So if we take the Pearson's Education 2013, they provide a definition of a concerted and coordinated set of activities designed to achieve a goal or objective. Coordinated set of activities designed to achieve a goal or objective. And we have to go into a little bit more detail in terms of what we mean by strategy, because when you're looking at the competition and you're looking at using different models, you have to actually assess or take a more holistic view in terms of what's happening in terms of the strategy of other companies, to know how you're going to compete against them. So if we look at the five, we can see these include various things, including arenas, vehicles, differentiators, staging, and economic logic. And these are going to have an impact in terms of where you want to go, why you want to go there, and who are your competitors in those marketplaces, and how you're going to compete with them. Arenas, where will we be active, which product categories, which channels, which market segments, which geographic areas, which core technologies, which value creation stages. So what exactly do you want to sell in that new marketplace? If we look at Tesco's, when Tesco's wanted to go into America, they wasn't selling their whole range of goods and services and all the electronics and all their clothing, but they were focusing on their foods. So again, which product categories, it was their foods. So what market segments were they targeting? Which geographical areas in the US were they going to target as well? Vehicles. How are we going to get there? Is it going to be by a joint venture, strategic alliance, licensing, franchising, mergers or acquisitions, or completely, investment into another country in terms of buying or renting retail stores to set up your complete operation? How is it going to be done? And the way it is done will have either more or less control, and it will have either a lesser or greater degree of risk. But with the greater risk, normally comes with greater profits as well. Differentiators, how will we win? What is going to be our image? What is going to be our pricing? Are we going for cost-based pricing, market penetration, market skimming? What's going to be our pricing strategy in relation to the competitors in that marketplace? Staging. What will be our speed and sequence of moves? How fast do you want to react? Speed of expansion, sequence of initiatives, interval between events. And if we take the economic logic, how will returns be obtained? Okay, is it through the lowest cost through scale advantages? Lowest cost through scope, replication advantages. Premium prices due to proprietary product features. Premium prices due to matchable services. So what's the economic logic behind it? If we look at Zara has got great economies of scale. Obviously they have various technologies and they vertically integrated backwards into their supply chain, but they have over 2,000 stores in over 100 different countries, and they have great economies of scale because they can buy on a larger scale than other companies. So when you're looking at strategy, you have to say to yourselves, well, what are you going to adopt in terms of these key factors, in terms of the arenas, the vehicles, the differentiators, and staging, and combined with the economic logic behind it. So here we're going to look at now Porter's, you know, five force model, and we've kind of covered this over the last 2 years in different units in business and business environment, in business strategy, global business environment. So we've seen Porter's five force model, and the different elements of Porter's five force model includes the threat of new entrants, the threat of substitute products, bargaining power of suppliers, bargaining power of buyers, and the rivalry amongst competitors. So we've got the 5 different areas of Porter's five force. So if we look at the threat of new entrants, is this going to be a barrier to entry for new companies to actually want to come into this marketplace? What is the time and cost of the new entrants? Do you need specialist knowledge? Will there be economies of scale? Are there any cost advantages? Technological production and barriers to entry. So, depending upon the marketplace and the investment needed and the speed, it could be, either a barrier kind of protecting you, or if it's the barrier is very low, threat of new entrants is high, then that could be a potential problem for you in that marketplace. If it's easy for companies to come in and compete against you, if it's more difficult for companies to come in and compete against you, then you stand in a better chance of being in that marketplace and surviving. What about the bargaining power, of buyers? Factors that you need to take into consideration includes the number of customers, size of each order, the differentiation between competitors. Is there a lot of differentiation where you can sell your products for a higher price or not? Is there price sensitivity? And what is the cost of changing? Likewise, the threat of substitutes, substitute performance and the cost of change. If it's easy for the cost of change is low for customers, and there is substitute performance where the performance is perceived to be high, and therefore there will be a high threat of substitutes. But if if the substitute performance is low and the cost of change is high, then the threat of substitutes will not be great to your marketplace. What about the bargaining power of suppliers, which will depend upon the number of suppliers? If there's a larger number of suppliers selling the same products, and you are a big retail outlet, then you're going to have a greater degree of bargaining power against those manufacturers of those products. What about the size of suppliers? The size of suppliers could also determine how much bargaining power you have over them. Your ability to substitute from different suppliers, and the cost of changing suppliers. What is the cost of changing from supplier to supplier? If it's a little change of little cost of changing from supplier, then again that means that you will have greater bargaining power over the suppliers because you can switch when you need to. And what about the rivalry amongst competitors? This will depend upon the number of competitors in the marketplace, the quality differences and other differences. Are the differences between your product and another product? If it's significant enough, then you have a competitive advantage and the competition will be less. But if it's more standardized, then the competition will be more intense. What about switching costs and customer loyalty? Do you have customer loyalty? Do you have a brand image or a brand name that customers want to repeat purchase to your brand? So when we're looking at Porter's five force model, we relate this to company examples to actually see, how they fare in terms of the bargaining power of suppliers, the bargaining power of buyers, threat of substitutes. Is the threat of new entrants high or low? And how competitive is the industry itself with other competitors? which would depend upon your branding, standardization, or product differentiation. So again, you would use this porters to see, how well you could actually compete within a marketplace. But Porter's five force model will give you an idea in terms of who the competitors are, and the bargaining powers. But this is not the only model that you should be looking at, because you need to take a lot or additional factors into consideration. So I would like you to watch this video on Michael Porter discussing his five force model. So if you can ensure you've downloaded Zapworks onto your mobile, and once you've downloaded Zapworks, open up the software and then place your phone over this logo, and then the first page will be the P7 videos I would like you to watch, which you should have watched already, and then go to P8 videos and then click on the Michael Porter's one. Many thanks for that.
Welcome to today's lesson, where we're looking at Porter's diamond model. So the model is used by businesses to analyze the external competitive environment. This information can then explain the relative strength of one business against another, and it also explains why some industries are more advantageous than others in a particular region. Now, in the model, Porter attempts to answer the following questions. Why does one nation become the most competitive for a certain industry? Now, in the model, Porter refers to this as becoming the home base. So, for example, Germany is a home base for car manufacturing. And the second question is, why are companies from one country or region able to sustain competitive advantage in a particular industry? In the diamond model, the answers to these questions are the determinants of competitive advantage. So, according to the model, there are four factors that determine national competitive advantage. Porter represented these four determinants as a diamond, as you can see in the diagram. Now, you can think of the four determinants as being the playing field for the industries of a particular nation. And the four determinants are factor conditions, demand conditions, related and supporting industries, and firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. Now, these are the major determinants in the model, but they're not the only ones. The model also shows that there are two extra determinants that can influence any or all of the four determinants, and these are government policy and chance conditions. So let's look at each. So factor conditions refer to the different types of resources that may or may not be present within a nation. Now, resources include such things like human resources, capital resources, natural resources, infrastructure, that kind of thing. Now, to understand the role of factor conditions, we need to make a distinction between basic and advanced factor conditions. Basic factor conditions include things like natural resources and unskilled labour, whereas advanced factor conditions include things like skilled labour, specialist knowledge, specialist capital. Now, Porter argues that basic factor conditions do not generate competitive advantage, and that's because they can actually be obtained by anyone if they just apply money to the problem. Now, only advanced factor conditions can generate real, true competitive advantage. So, as an example of an advanced factor, MIT produces graduates with very high computing skills, and this in turn feeds a software competitive advantage for the United States. Now, another factor for the US is having a large pool of venture capital seeking to invest in technology startups. And this factor condition further builds competitive advantage for the IT or tech industry in the US. So number two is of demand conditions is really home market demand. So to have a competitive advantage for an industry, there must be very strong home market demand for the product or service that these companies are producing. Now, in fact, the more demanding home market customers are, the greater the pressure on companies to innovate and to improve. And these demand conditions create a competitive advantage for that nation over time. Now, demand conditions include things like market size, market growth rate, and also the market sophistication. And another factor which can determine demand conditions is early home market saturation. So early home market saturation can encourage people to innovate to keep selling. So number 3, related. Success of one industry can be dependent on the success of related industries or suppliers within that nation. Now, the presence of internationally competitive suppliers can be helpful to the company using those suppliers, and that's because it gives cost-effective access to inputs, and alongside this it gives early access to new products and encourages the rapid sharing of information, perhaps because they share the same language. Now, having lots of related industries within a nation sometimes results in brand new industries, and that happens where the related industries can share resources. So, for example, car manufacturers in Germany could share access to a wind tunnel, and this use of shared resources within a nation can create a competitive advantage as it increases the barrier to entry for competitors. So finally, number 4, Now, the competitiveness of firms in one nation is determined by how those firms set strategy and structure themselves. It's also determined by how much competition there is between firms in the industry. Now, how firms are structured and set goals is going to differ from nation to nation, and it's determined by a whole bunch of things, including social factors, political factors, legal factors, a whole bunch of other things. Now, intense rivalry causes a drive to innovate. So, as an example, German car manufacturers BMW, Mercedes, and Volkswagen wouldn't be so successful without the existence of each other, because the intense rivalry drives innovation and makes them successfully internationally. So, while describing Porter's diamond model above, we touched upon the German car industry, but now let's use it for a complete example. So to understand the national competitive advantage that the German car industry has, let's look at each of the 4 determinants in turn. Now, it's worth noting that they don't exist in isolation, they all interact with each other. So first, let's look at factor conditions. So one factor condition that exists to make the German car industry competitive is the existence of specialist education establishments. Now, these establishments produce graduates with a specialism, obviously, in car engineering. Now, being a global centre for engineering excellence keeps the industry evolving at a rate that is difficult for competitors to keep up with. Next, demand conditions. Now, there's strong and intense home demand for German cars, with consumers expecting better and better cars all the time. And also, on some autobahn, there is no speed limit, and this causes demand for cars with ever greater performance levels. And this intense demand combined with high expectation keeps competition high, and it's this furious competition that forces the industry to constantly evolve and makes it competitive internationally. Number 3, related and supporting industries. Now, there's many related industries and suppliers within Germany, but just one example is IT suppliers such as Siemens and SAP. Now, these firms themselves have a global competitive advantage, but by working together with these firms, the car industry can enhance its national competitive advantage even further. Because now they don't just have excellent engineering, but they also have excellent IT, and that raises the bar of entry for competitors even higher. It makes it even harder for them to enter the market. And finally, firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. Now, an intense intercompany rivalry between firms such as Mercedes, BMW, and Volkswagen feeds rapid innovation as each firm competes for the attention of customers. And finally, number 5, government. German car industry. And that's says, now the government has invested in creating and funding institutions that perform scientific research, and those same institutions train the best engineers. Now the government has also invested in infrastructure, so by building new autobahn without speed limits, that helps intensify home demand conditions. So by satisfying all determinants in the Porter-Diamond model, the German car industry has built a sustainable national competitive advantage, and this competitive advantage is further reinforced with the help of the German government. So there are some criticisms which are often levelled at the Porter-Diamond model, including the model was developed by examining just 10 developed countries, and because of this the model only applies really to developed countries. There is much evidence also to show that the national competitiveness of a nation is influenced by factors which are outside that nation, and that's, I think, pretty obvious. Thirdly, not all firms which begin in the home country are successful, and that suggests that there may be other factors in play. And finally, and I think this is the biggest one, it's not clear how the model applies in today's service economy. So for example, how can the model be used to analyse the success of McDonald's or Burger King? So in summary, the Porter-Diamond model is a strategic economic model that attempts to explain why one nation-state is more successful than another for a particular industry. Now, according to the model, for an industry to have a national competitive advantage, 4 determinant factors must be present. And additionally, the actions of government and chance can play a role in determining if an industry achieves a competitive advantage. So that's it for today's lesson. Really hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
So we've taken that from. So we've taken that from a well-known speaker. We've seen that with Porter's diamond model, it is dependent upon the 4 factors plus additional elements in terms of chance. But as it was stated that this was really, the research for this was only undertaken to developing countries and in specific industries, so it's not relevant to all industries, and it didn't target other emerging type markets. So now we're going to look at Porter's generic strategies as another way to look at competition within another marketplace, be it domestically or internationally. And with Porter's generic strategies for creating competitive advantage, you either take a broad target approach with cost leadership, or differentiation, or you take a narrow type of target focused on cost focus or focused differentiation. And on the left hand side you've got really the competitive scope, and right hand side you've got the competitive advantage, how you actually want to gain your competitive advantage. Cost leadership, how is really the company going to gain competitive advantage through cost leadership? They can do this in many ways, by vertically integrating backwards into their supply chain, getting hold and manufacturing now in the products, by going internationally and globally, and therefore buying a huge a greater quantity of stock, therefore getting economies of scale. And if you're getting economies of scale, then you're getting cheaper cost of goods. And if you have your sales which are increasing with cheaper cost of goods, then you're going to get a greater gross profit margin. Then if you maintain your costs and you implement systems which are cost cutting and not significantly adding costs to the business, then you will have a low administration charge in your profit and loss account, and therefore a higher net profit. With cost leadership, actively lower costs throughout the entire supply chain are actually sought after. Keep in mind that a cost leader can't simply just make a cheaper product. Therefore, you have to, as we've stated before, look at all the methods and principles and um, you know processes that you put into place. Tesco's have a process of um, stocking or selling other manufacturers' electrical goods, but they don't actually bring them into their warehouse and stock them themselves. So they will take the order for those goods and then send the order out to that company, and the company would send it out direct to the customer themselves. So this principle is called cross-docking. So they have cross-docking policies. They also implement various policies like lean, continuous improvement, and total quality management. So they're trying always to improve, cut down on waste, and increase and improve upon productivity and efficiencies. When we're talking about cost leadership, a company must maintain its quality of its products, while lowering the cost of production through efficiency, size, scale, scope, and a learning curve as well. So this is we've seen as well for various companies like Tesco's, always aiming to one, increase their sales with their different stores, trying to um, gain economies of scale with their bargaining power, but all their number of stores which they have, both domestically and internationally, and also with their processes and practices and how they're trying to implement various principles. When we're talking about cost leadership, its products must be on par with competitors. Otherwise, customers will stop buying them and look for better quality alternatives. You know, and especially when you have a highly competitive marketplace. When you have a highly competitive marketplace like the food retail industry in the UK, you see people have to constantly be innovative and creative. If we see the way Tesco's have lost 10% of their market share over the last 10 years through competition from Aldi and Lidl, we can see there that Tesco's have lost, profits from their sales because customers are going elsewhere. What did they do? They looked for innovative and creative ways to target new market segments. So they bought Booker's, and Booker's, then supply, various small retail one or two shop owners. So again, these are Tesco's products but branded with different companies' brands. It's again increasing their market segment to other retail stores within the marketplace. So again, cost leadership will be looking for creative and innovative ways, trying to cut down costs within their business, as well as trying to get economies of scale and trying to increase sales, but at the same time, trying to be competitive with other companies selling their products, especially as we've seen with Aldi and Lidl and Tesco's. If we look at the fast food chain, it's proven to be very successful using this strategy. They keep costs low by maintaining a division of labour that allows them to employ and train inexperienced staff instead of skilled cooks. This method allows them to hire field managers, who usually receive higher wages. Again, so we see the cost leadership in terms of McDonald's. McDonald's is very, very, very successful. Also, establishing their franchise system in terms of increasing their market share. A McDonald's store predominantly costs about £1 million to buy, to franchise, and then again McDonald's have vertically integrated backwards, so they have their own farms with their own cows and their own chickens, and then they supply the whole supply chain. So making sure that they maintain the quality and the standards in terms of what's going into the foods, and also because they have vertically integrated backwards and they are maintaining standards, and they've got huge economies of scale, they can maintain their low cost advantage. And if we cost focus refers to organizations who seeks to develop a lower cost advantage but within a small market segment. So still a cost focus, but within a specific segment of goods. These products will generally be very basic, vaguely similar to the average market leading products. The more popular products, can be charged at a higher price and will be acceptable, to a sufficient number of customers in order to make a profit. An example would be budget food items or other household tools stocked only by small local supermarkets. Another would be a low-cost, regional airline which focuses only on specific routes. These products are often referred to as, Me Too's products. So what about the other areas in the Porter's generic strategy? We have differentiation focus and differentiation leadership. In a differentiation focus strategy, the organization will look to develop a product differentiation, but only with one, or a smaller number of market segments. Again, you're trying to, a bit like the cost focus, you're trying to target a small segment of products that are differentiated in some way, shape, or form. A good example would be to see, craft beer companies who can charge a higher price compared with, large breweries due to the uniqueness of their products. Differentiation leadership, well, again, differentiation-led organizations is to make their products different or more attractive than any other within the industry to achieve a competitive advantage. Differentiation. And there are different ways to gain a competitive advantage. It could be down to their marketing and their branding and their perception, even their difference in terms of their slickness of their product. Apple have a differentiated leadership. They differentiate their leadership in terms of their branding, in terms of the functionality, constantly developing, constantly increasing the functionality, looking at the needs of customers and seeing how they can differentiate their products between another. When mobile phones first came out, Apple first launched its phones, and there was BlackBerry on the marketplace. So there was a few phones on the marketplace, and Blackberries were targeting a specific target market, mainly younger people, men and young women. But again, the Apple were targeting a different market segment, and their design and their slickness and their ease of use and their functionality was far different. Its products must be on par with competitors, otherwise, consumers will stop buying them and look for a better quality alternative. So it must be, better than what's out there already. So when we look at the competition and we look at different models, we can see the different models, and we have to say to ourselves, how we're going to assess competitors. And how we assess competitors really is to look at obviously the strategy of the organization and the different determinants of strategy. We need to look at different models that we can use to see how risky it can be to be in a specific marketplace in terms of utilizing Porter's 5-force model. But Porter's 5-force model is limited in its approach in terms of taking into consideration other variables. Because if you're going international, you want to know, does a organization have a national competitive advantage? And so then you need to take into consideration the national competitive advantage model. And then if you want to get down from company to company in terms of how they position themselves in the marketplace, then maybe you also need to use Porter's generic strategy. So when looking at the different models and approaches to compare competitors and to assess competitors, I don't think that you can just use one specific model, but rather as many models as possible to try and get a viewpoint from different perspectives and different angles to come up then with a strategy in terms of how you're going to tackle a specific marketplace. Does that company have a national advantage in that in their domestic market? how well will you compete using Porter's five force model, and when you're competing head on against specific companies, what type of strategy are you going to adopt? So looking at the conclusions, we have kind of covered the question, broken down the question and looked at the keywords. We've looked at what the definition for marketing strategy and the different elements of marketing strategy. We've reviewed briefly Porter's five force model. Determinants of a nation's competitive advantage and the different elements and chance elements, as well as Porter's generic strategy and conclusions. So I hope this has been helpful. Thank you from Mr. Tan.